For a fractious coalition that at times seems to be held together with spit, baling wire, and old memories of Barack Obama, the Democratic Party has a remarkably singular message: Donald Trump is an existential threat to the country. For the Biden campaign, the existential threat to democracy has become the overriding theme in his bid for re-election. There is one existential threat, it's Donald Trump, Biden said at a fundraiser in February. For the environmental activists in the party, climate change is the existential concern, and a Trump victory would be devastating for the planet. As Biden himself argued at Thursday's debate, the only existential threat to humanity is climate change, and Trump didn't do a damn thing about it. Reproductive rights, too, are cast in existential terms. Trump poses an existential threat to abortion rights in Pennsylvania, Democratic U.S. Rep. Mary Gay Scanlon said at a press conference in April. If given the chance, he will ban abortion across the country with or without Congress. Existential math, as it happens. I know a little bit about existential threats, having written a book in 2019 on the subject. It refers to those threats that could conceivably risk the extinction or widespread destruction of humanity. The real way to tell the difference between an existential threat and a more ordinary one is not what people warning say, it's what they do. Existential threats demand existential responses. After all, if you conceivably felt the country and perhaps even the world were truly at risk, you'd presumably do everything you could to prevent that catastrophe. When it comes to the Democrats and the left, from the Biden campaign on down to the activists, it is impossible to look at what they're doing and conclude that they truly believe Donald Trump is an existential threat, and that may pose an existential challenge to the party. Winning is the only thing Biden entered Thursday night's debate clearly losing, and it's safe to say that afterward, very few people, outside perhaps Biden's inner circle, think the president is positioned to win this election. The debate spotlighted the one issue that voters have repeatedly told pollsters is a serious problem. The one issue Biden can do almost nothing to change: his age. And rather than seizing a rare opportunity to disprove those fears, Biden's halting, often disoriented performance did the opposite. Cue the Democratic panic and an entire New York Times editorial board worth of columnists urging Biden to step aside. The campaign instantly said, as it has said every time these calls have been made, that the president would do no such thing, and at this point, there's little reason not to believe them. Some of this is risk aversion. A president has never called off a re-election bid this late in the campaign, and no one really knows what would come next. Some of it is presumably pride. Biden is a proud man who was on his third try for the presidency when he finally won in 2020. Giving up is not really in his DNA. Some of it is political calculation. If the president steps aside, the logical candidate is Vice President Kamala Harris, but Harris has struggled in office and her poor poll ratings mirror those of Biden. If the Democratic Party tries to sideline Harris and open the door to other candidates through an open convention, they risk alienating her and her supporters and opening up further wounds in the Democratic coalition. Bad choices, all. But the nature of an existential threat is that everything else, feelings, ambition, everything, is put aside. Yet even as the chance of a second Trump presidency rises by the day, the Democratic political establishment does nothing. That's not how you act in the face of an existential threat. Existential until it isn't. It's not just politicians, though. The winners of presidential elections pick Supreme Court justices, and it was obvious that a then 83-year-old Ruth Bader Ginsburg might not make it through the next presidential term after the 2016 election, potentially imperiling abortion rights, among other Democratic priorities. Yet Ginsburg, buoyed by a number of Democratic supporters who viewed calls for her retirement as sexist, refused to step down. We all know what happened later. One would think that sitting Democratic justices would have learned from Ginsburg's example and acted differently in the face of a new supposedly existential threat from Trump. Yet Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, who are 70 and 64, respectively, have so far refused to heed increasingly desperate calls from writers like my colleague Ian Millhiser to step down and lock in their seats for decades. Each has perfectly good reasons to stay on. As did Ginsburg, none of those reasons make sense in the face of a true existential threat. Nowhere is the gap between existential rhetoric and existential action greater than in climate change, which has emerged in recent years as one of the top priorities for Democrats. You can't find a climate activist and, increasingly, a Democratic politician who doesn't frame climate change as an existential issue. With reason, the worst-case climate scenarios really do represent something like an existential threat to the future of not just the us, but the entire world. And given Trump's determined opposition to actual climate policy, it's fair to view his potential return to the White House as a part of that threat. Yet there is a clear and yawning gap between climate rhetoric and climate action. On the Democratic political side, that's perhaps understandable. Climate change is not a top priority for most voters, and politicians have to grapple with that fact. You can't save the Earth if you don't have the votes. Too often, though, climate activists and groups end up opposing many of the new energy projects that are needed to actually decarbonize energy, from transmission lines to solar projects to wind power, often tying them up in years of litigation. The Sunrise Movement, one of the most radical climate activist groups out there, has bafflingly withheld its endorsement from Biden so far, even though he prioritized passage of the most ambitious climate bill in US history. The groups have reasons for what they're doing. There are always reasons, but if climate change were treated as the existential threat the loudest activists say it is, those reasons wouldn't matter. Do you believe what you say? Treating an existential threat as existential requires the one thing that the Democratic coalition has increasingly struggled to do: prioritization. It means putting aside personal feelings, individual ambition, and subjective preferences in favor of a single goal: success. Otherwise, it's just empty rhetoric. As New York Times columnist Ezra Klein, who has been pushing the possibility of an open convention to replace Biden, said on his podcast after Thursday's debate, if the fate of American democracy is hinging on this election, as Democrats are always telling me it is, and as I think there is a chance that it is, then you should do everything you can to win it. That a strategy, any strategy, might make people or groups uncomfortable cannot be a reason not to pursue it in the face of an existential threat. Not if you believe what you're saying. We remind former President Donald J. Trump has vowed to cancel President Biden's policies for cutting pollution from fossil fuel burning power plants, terminate efforts to encourage electric vehicles, and develop the liquid gold that is right under our feet by promoting oil and gas. Those changes and others that Mr. Trump has promised, if he were to win the presidency again, represent a 180-degree shift from Mr. Biden's climate agenda. When he was president, Mr. Trump reversed more than 100 environmental protections put in place by the Obama administration. Mr. Biden has in turn reversed much of Mr. Trump's agenda. But climate advocates argue a second Trump term would be far more damaging than his first, because the window to keep rising global temperatures to relatively safe levels is rapidly closing. It would become an all-out assault on any possible progress on climate change, said Pete Maysmith, the senior vice president of campaigns at the League of Conservation Voters, an environmental group. Senior Republicans don't necessarily disagree. Michael McKenna, who worked in the Trump White House and is supporting Mr. Trump's bid for a second term, said the approach to climate change would likely be one of indifference. I doubt very seriously we're going to spend any time working on it, Mr. McKenna said. To the contrary, he said, the Biden administration's climate regulations would be in trouble. Mr. Trump's first term was marked by carelessness in its legal work, which led to some of his efforts to overturn Obama-era climate policies rejected by courts. Neil Chatterjee, chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission under Mr. Trump, said the former president's team has learned from its past mistakes. It will be a far more organized and coherent legal and regulatory strategy if there's a Trump 2.0, Mr. Chatterjee said, adding, these guys know what they're doing now. Here are 5 of the most significant reversals a Trump administration could bring on climate. 1. Coal and gas power plants, the fossil fuel burning plants that keep our lights on or power our heat and air conditioning, are responsible for a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions generated by the United States. Reducing them is key to Mr. Biden's plan to tackle climate change. Environmental Protection Agency regulations finalized on Thursday would force coal plants to either deploy technology to capture virtually all their emissions or shut down. New gas plants constructed in the U.S. also would have to meet strict emissions standards. The Biden administration estimated the rules governing coal plants would cut 1.38 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide between now and 2047, which is equivalent to preventing the annual emissions from 328 million gasoline-powered cars. Editors' picks amid challenges. Small New York City museums are closing their doors. Ghosting is an inescapable part of dating. Is it ever okay? What to do about erectile dysfunction, Mr. Trump has deployed a mixture of truth and falsehoods when describing this policy. He has said it will force coal plants to shut down, which is likely accurate. He also said it will force gas plants to close, which is not true. And he has said that renewable energy cannot keep the lights on, also untrue. If elected, Mr. Trump said he will reverse the regulation on coal-burning electricity and greenlight the construction of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of brand new, beautiful power plants that actually work. 2. Automobile emissions standards. Mr. Trump has spoken particularly aggressively about electric vehicles. Transportation is responsible for another quarter of U.S. greenhouse gases, with cars and trucks making up the bulk. Mr. Biden has imposed limits on pollution from automobile tailpipes, rules designed to ensure that the majority of new passenger cars and light trucks sold in the United States are all electric or hybrids by 2032. Mr. Trump has said those regulations will lead to a bloodbath in the U.S. economy, kill the auto industry, and trigger an assassination of jobs. He has pledged to reverse them. That's going to be the first order of business, to unwind all that, Mr. McKenna said. If Mr. Trump is elected, I think everybody's been pretty clear about that. 3. The Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act, which Mr. Biden signed into law in 2022, is the nation's largest investment in fighting climate change. It contains more than $370 billion in tax credits over 10 years to help shift the U.S. toward cleaner forms of energy, offering incentives to companies to make electric vehicles, batteries, and to consumers to buy those vehicles, switch to solar energy, and buy things like electric heat pumps to heat and cool their homes. Mr. Trump, who has called the IRA the biggest tax hike in history, is widely expected to try to gut much of the law. Incentives for people to buy electric vehicles, which Mr. Trump has called one of the dumbest decisions he's heard, would certainly be on the chopping block, Republicans said. So would measures to support businesses that install electric vehicle charging stations. Tax credits for solar and wind power could be in the crosshairs of his administration, as could incentives for consumers to buy heat pumps or make their homes more energy efficient. Yet even Republican opponents of the climate law acknowledge that undoing those tax incentives will be hard, in large part because many of the battery manufacturing facilities and new electric vehicle plants are being built in Republican districts. Unfortunately, the wind and solar and EV guys have all got their hooks in red states, so clawing back that money is more difficult to do, said Stephen J. Milloy, a climate change denialist who worked on Mr. Trump's transition team in 2020. Still, Mr. Milloy said, a Trump administration could do a lot to slow down a transition to clean energy, even if the tax breaks remains. What the IRA doesn't do is force anybody to approve wind farms or solar farms, he said, adding, I don't see those getting approved under a Trump administration. I see extremely thorough investigations into whale deaths and other environmental problems. There is no evidence that offshore wind farms cause whale deaths. Mr. Trump has also railed against wind farms, saying falsely they cause cancer. For oil and gas drilling if he wins a second term. Mr. Trump has promised to unleash domestic energy production like never before. Primarily he is talking about coal, oil, and gas, the three main fossil fuels. While President Biden has certainly approved some big fossil fuel projects, like the enormous Willow oil development in the North Slope of Alaska, and the U.S. is producing more oil than any country ever, Mr. Biden has also tried to curb future development. His administration has approved the smallest offshore oil program in history. It has protected hundreds of millions of acres of wilderness from mining and drilling. Earlier this month, Mr. Biden blocked oil and gas development within 13 million acres of wilderness in Alaska. The U.S. is the world's leading exporter of liquefied natural gas, but the Biden administration has paused permits for new export terminals while the Department of Energy studies the effects of gas exports on national security, the economy, and climate. Mr. Trump has promised to immediately lift that pause and greenlight pipelines and other energy projects. We're going to drill, baby, drill, right away, Mr. Trump told supporters in January. David Hayes, a former Biden administration climate advisor, said he expects a Trump White House would revive drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the country's premier wildlife sanctuary. Mr. Biden canceled 7 oil leases in the refuge last year. They're going to look for symbolism, so they're going to try to open other sensitive areas on public lands, Mr. Hayes said of a Trump White House.